Today we are going to make an overnight sourdough, and I already wanted to show you here at the start. That's going to be how our bread will look like in the end. I call this overnight sourdough because you do everything before you go to bed, and then you let your dough rest for 7 to 8 hours overnight, and you continue in the morning. And by doing this overnight, we don't have that much time to do stretch and folds or anything like that. So we also need to adjust our recipe a little bit. In this case, I'm aiming for 65% hydration, which would be per 100 grams of flour, I'm using 65 grams of water. I'm going to be making 2 loaves of each 500 grams of flour, so that would be 650 grams of water. And I'm doing that because over time, when you ferment your sourdough, your dough becomes more acidy. And this means that your gluten structure is going to be damaged. Now, if you're making a very wet dough with high hydration, overnight can be a bit of an issue because you don't have time to apply stretch and folds. So that's why I'm reducing a little bit the hydration, because I want to counteract this effect. Now I'm adding the salt. That's 2%, so that means 1000 grams of flour and 20 grams of salt. Now you can see me adding the water, and then lastly I'm also going to add directly the sourdough starter. Normally you would want to autolyze your dough, but in this case I want to do everything together because I'm trying to make a sourdough with as little effort as possible. Normally I would leave my dough to rest, just the flour and the water, let it rest, allow the dough to form a strong gluten network automatically, but in this case we want to do everything together, spend as little time as possible on this. And now I'm just gonna start kneading a little bit. I'm stirring this together just with my hand like that. And actually you just saw I'm gonna plant some stuff this year on the balcony. You saw that on the right. Anyways, I'm just putting it together, I'm stirring it, starting to stretch and fold this a little bit. There's no special technique for this. And then I'm gonna let it rest for 15 minutes or so, and then in the end I will be doing another coil fold. So I let it rest for 15 minutes and then I did another coil fold. I'm gonna link the video right here. And now it's ready to ferment overnight. I've been using cold water because I want to slow down the fermentation process. I'm placing it here close to the window where it's very cold. And this is the dough, how it looks like the next morning. You see those nice pockets of air. Next step is we need to pre-shape this. We're going to divide the dough and then we will be doing the pre-shaping. And for this I'm using wetted hands to remove the dough. It actually expanded a little bit too much almost overnight. But yeah, since it's a long fermentation time frame, typically it's only 5 hours, but overnight this was 8 hours in total. That's why I used cold water, because I wanted to slow down the process. Yeast is so much more active when it's warm, and I did not want to over ferment my dough. And here you can see me applying another coil fold, and just look at how the dough is coming together, nice and smooth. For overnight, I definitely recommend to go with less water like I did in this recipe. This of course also depends a little bit on the flour that you're using. What a beautiful loaf right there. I just love the silkiness of this dough. I'm now going to take my dough scraper and I'm going to start dividing it into 2 portions. I just like to mark it like this so that I know where I have to cut. With a concise and quick movement, actually here I'm correcting it a little bit because I was not so satisfied. Cut down, be very quick and use a lot of force when you cut. Don't use multiple cuts ideally, because you are damaging the crumb structure of your dough. And now I'm going to show you how to pre-shape this. Go with a 45-degree angle and push it and rotate. Push and rotate. And this way we're turning our dough into a nice looking silky ball. This is what we want, because we want to have a solid basis to do a proper shaping afterwards. To me, this is the hardest step almost about the whole baking process. It takes a lot of effort. If your dough is too fermented, this could be very, very annoying because your dough is going to stick too much. This only works if you properly fermented your dough. So pre-shaping. That's why I like to bake buns sometimes, because you can test on more breads at the same time. And actually for buns it's the same recipe, except that you make smaller chunks. Again, I'm pushing at a 45-degree angle and I'm rotating. Push and rotate. This is the pre-shaping process. It probably took me 30 or 40 or maybe even 100 loaves to master this, but it is a really useful technique to know, because you are going to need this for pizza, bread rolls, and basically any other bread baking. I'm gonna let them bench rest now for 15 minutes. I want them to relax a little bit, because then I can pull them better on top of each other afterwards. Now, 15 minutes later, I'm preparing my banneton, and I'm going to be doing 2 different kinds of loaves. I'm gonna make one batard, which is this kind of shape, and I'm also going to make a boule, which is a round shape. I'm covering them with rice flour because I don't want the dough to stick. You could also use regular flour. It's probably going to work out in this case, and here you can see me using my boule as well. But rice flour works better because it absorbs the water better, especially if you have doughs which have a lot of hydration. Then rice flour is really recommended. The worst thing you want to happen is that your dough starts sticking to your banneton before you're about to bake it. The dough probably rested now for around 15 minutes or so. And yeah, let's get started. I'm going to show you 2 different techniques. We're going to start with this one. This is actually the only time now where you need a little bit of flour. Before you did not need any extra flour. It's important that there is no flour in the previous step, because else you cannot tuck the dough over your surface. And now we're going to add flour, because we don't want the dough to stick now. We have the nice smooth and silky side upwards. It's also going to be outwards in the end. And we don't want this to stick to the counter. So take a little bit of flour. This is actually the first time we really add this flour. Before, we don't want any flour. And make sure that your hands are also a little bit floured, because we don't want the dough to stick to your hands now. We're going to be making the boule now, and I'm going to show you. Use the bench scraper to remove the dough. It's stuck to your surface, so it's going to stick a little bit to your bench scraper. Take the dough and just spread it a little bit. This creates a higher surface, and with a higher surface we have a bigger sticky side. So the side that's facing us now is the sticky side. Be swift and gentle, but also at the same time concise with your hands movement. Now I'm taking this and I'm flipping this over. I'm making the sticky side stick to itself. Same thing again from the right hand side. I'm taking this, pulling this into the middle, and make the sticky sides stick to itself. And look how the dough is already coming together. Now we have some more sticky sides at the top, and I'm going to be pulling them into the middle. And then the last sticky side into the middle. Now we're applying something which is called stitching, which is basically taking the dough from the left and the right hand side and pulling it into the middle. This creates additional strength. This takes a little bit of effort and a little bit of practice. It's not required, but it gives additional strength. Now I'm taking the dough, I'm pulling it, and then I'm rolling it on top of each other. This creates super strength. This is something you should always do. Look at this, it came together, and we can even see some nice bubbles there. Because I want this to be a batard, sorry, not a batard, I want this to be a boule, I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna pull it over the surface a little bit with my hands. This only works if you did not use too much flour. And by doing so, I'm basically rounding up the edges. We want this to be round, right? And this is a great way in the end to make it very, very nice and round. So the basic shaping for the batard and the boule, it's the same. Now, take the bench scraper and place the dough inside of your floured banneton. That's boule. Next up, we're gonna be making the batard. So it's the same dough, basically, just different ways of shaping. It really depends on what you prefer personally. I like batards more, but that's just my personal preference. Boules are typically easier to bake in a round Dutch oven. Make sure that you have some flour on the surface, add a little bit more. We don't want the smooth and silky side to stick. All right, now the dough is stuck again. With your bench scraper, remove it. You could also use a knife if you don't have a bench scraper. And same thing again, spread it. You want it to have a bigger surface area because you want to make the dough stick to itself as much as possible. Flip it into the middle. Take the right hand side, pull it into the middle. Left hand side, pull it over. Now, sometimes here my hand sticks, but just remove the hand from the bottom. Same thing again, pull it in the middle. And now we're going to be applying some stitching again. This, I think, is one of the hardest parts actually. Go ahead. I'm correcting my stitching a little bit here. Pull it outwards and roll it on top of each other. Pull, roll, like this basically. I'm pushing the dough inside. And looking good. Now I'm gonna roll this over the surface a little bit to give it a more batard-like shape. You can also use the bench scraper to do this if it sticks a little bit too much to your hands. I'm just rounding this up a little bit and it's coming together and looking really good. So almost the same as making a boule, just really slightly different. A bench scraper really comes in very handy here in this process. I'm happy with this. And now I'm going to take it again and I'm going to place it in the floured banneton. Like this. Perfect. So the hardest part has been done so far. Flour it a little bit more because we're going to be covering it with a cloth. You can also just use a plastic bag, it doesn't really matter, but I don't want this to stick to the plastic bag or the cloth. So that's why I'm adding a little bit of flour here. Now the proofing time starts. That's the final rise or the final rising phase of the bread. Typically, I would recommend you to just store your dough 24 hours in the fridge. It's a really good way to have a consistent environment, and it's going to be the same between all the bakes. But in this case, since guests will arrive in the evening, I want the dough to be ready in the evening. I'm going to put it at room temperature where it's going to rise for an hour, and then afterwards I'm going to put it into the fridge. The fridge is really good because in the fridge you slow down the whole process, and at the same time the gas inside of your dough becomes cold. This means you will have more oven spring in the end because the cold gas will expand more. It's a really good way to get oven spring. And since I like to have consistent time frames between every bake, I really find this method to be very good because in the fridge I always have the same temperature. At room temperature, it's always different depending on the season, depending on how much I heat. Yeah, so let's bake this. I have my Dutch oven preheated. I'm gonna place this on top of my banneton, turn this around, and let's hope the dough doesn't stick. That's the worst thing that can happen. But no, looking good. The dough has been at room temperature for an hour and then another 8 hours in the fridge. Now I'm taking my lamb and I'm going to score the bread. This is also very hard, you need to practice it. Try cutting it at a 45-degree angle and be swift when cutting it. Also works better with a cold dough. I'm spraying the loaf with additional water because I want the dough to stay hydrated. That's also why people use the Dutch oven. Basically the steam cannot escape during the first period of the bake. But you always want to make sure that you remove the Dutch oven after the second half because you want to have a nice crust. One trick which I like to do is I just like to spray additional water into the Dutch oven directly to create a really moist environment. Of course, if you have an oven with steam functionality, you don't need this, but I don't have a fancy oven like that. After half the bake, around 25 minutes at 230 degrees Celsius, I'm removing the lid and look how beautiful this loaf came together. We want this to be crusty now, and that's why we are removing the top part. Back to the oven for around another 20 minutes, but this depends. And here you go, the final looking bread. Beautiful ear, I'm very happy with the result. And now, normally you should wait a little bit longer. But since I wanted to show you this on video before the guests come, I'm going to cut this directly and show you the final result. This is always the moment where I'm a little bit scared and excited to see whether my baking has come together. Let's see about this. Crumb shot, beautiful looking crumb. It's not as open because we don't have that high hydration, but for an overnight sourdough, I feel this definitely came together very, very well. And here again, the final picture. Thanks a lot for watching.